And hello, and welcome to the Beyond Screens IndieCade show. My name is Alistair Aitchison. This is the show where we interview the creators of all things playful and game-like. There we go. Almost did that right. One of these days I'm going to do a perfect reading right at the beginning of the stream. The Beyond Screen show. This is the show where we interview the creators of all things playful and game-like that extend beyond the traditional inside the screen format. For example, we have shows about playable theatre, about escape rooms, we have shows about tabletop games, and alternative controllers. Now, we are in the run-up to the 2022 IndieCade Festival, and in celebration of that, we are hosting interviews with this year's finalists. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing to you the wonderful Choppy Copies and its creator, Jonah Warren. Jonah is a game designer and developer with a background making games about body movement, audio-visual musical instruments, and playable installations. He's also a game design professor at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. You can...
Perfect.
Oh, perfect. Excellent. Thank you, Jonah.
Yeah, you got it. Not easy.
So, Jonah's award-nominated game, Choppy Copies, is a VR sculpture-making challenge where the player races against the clock to carve duplicates of famous sculptures. Before we welcome Jonah onto the stage, let's have a look at Choppy Copies in action. Hello, Jonah. Welcome to the stream. Thanks very much for coming along. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you. And congratulations, of course, on the nomination.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm always a huge fan of IndieCade for many years and independent games in general. So, yeah, it's an honor.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming along. It's really nice to have you. And so you're calling us from Connecticut today, is that right?
Yep, Connecticut, North Haven, Connecticut in the U.S.
Right. Mm-hmm. Wow. So, and what's it like in Connecticut at the moment? Is it autumnal? I'm in Bristol in the UK, so we've got all the autumn leaves and everything. But I don't know, is Connecticut one of these places where you have 4 seasons, or is it?
Yes, no, definitely have 4 seasons, and we're in the thick of fall right now. So I think we're past peak, I guess. So yeah, the leaves are starting to fall. There's a lot of raking these days, but yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think we should hit the ground running. Tell us about Choppy Copies.
Sure. So Choppy Copies, as you probably have seen, is a fast-paced sculpting game made for VR, for virtual reality headsets. Essentially, you're given, you get to choose from a number of different kind of famous sculptures from art history, classical sculptures, and are given about 3 minutes to copy as best as you can, just kind of using your hand as a tool to wave around and carve just voxels from a slab. And then you're given a score based on how many of those voxels in your slab match the original. So yeah, it kind of, it's really a challenging game. It stemmed from just kind of an interest in sculpture and art in general. I kind of have a background in painting, so haven't had the opportunity to do sculpture all that much. And what I have done has been more kind of two-dimensional, not like life size. So that scale is also important for me to kind of to explore. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I was playing it. Obviously, that's the picture that you can see down in the corner is me having a go at the game. And yeah, I was playing it this weekend and really, really love it. It's so much fun. And like, I mean, for me, it kind of like it captured. Okay, this is the bit where I have to figure out which bit to gush about because I really, really enjoyed it. But I think, well, I mean, maybe to kick off, like, just. It's a bit I freeze up and get nervous. Okay. So I mean, let's start with like my favorite thing about it is that you're making these sculptures, you're against the clock, you can't make a perfect sculpture. And I think that's sort of part of the fun of it, like for me, came from this kind of sense that you can't be perfect and you just have to kind of try your best. Like, was that something that you kind of intended from the experience?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so this game was partially inspired by a previous game I made called Sloppy Forgeries, which was about copying famous paintings where you're just drawing. And similarly, you're given a short amount of time to complete a painting, and you're given a score based on how many pixels are the correct color, and it's an impossible task, right? And so I think just within art making in general. Like we were talking before the show, it can be really intimidating to folks who haven't made artwork. Just in terms of, there's a lot of skill in a lot of, like in the games I make, there's just this kind of like perceptual, like seeing and then transferring that to space on the screen. And so there is this kind of like intimidation. I have to make it perfect. But when you're given this constrained time where it's an impossible task for everybody, it kind of lowers the stakes and hopefully makes it a little easier just get started. There's also, there's no materials you're wasting within games. So it's not like, I'm this expensive oil paint I'm using up, or this canvas, or this even worse, like, block of marble.
Yeah.
So it's just, you can just kind of race in and do it. And I think, part of the fun is just, it's 3 minutes. So you do it and you kind of laugh at how terrible your artwork is. And then you can go do it again and kind of have fun with it.
Yeah. So, I mean, just for the audience, what you're seeing at home is this is me playing on. So right now it's one of the easier difficulties. So on the harder difficulties, the sculpture is made out of quite small voxels and it's quite precise how close you have to be. But on the easier levels, it's these nice big chunky voxels. I mean, do you see people when people are playing, like, is there a very different feel to how it feels to play an easy one in your eyes? Or is that sort of very much a kind of stepping stone to going towards like the harder ones being the kind of the main goal?
That's a good question. They feel kind of different, but they also are meant to be that stepping stone. I mean, that's why I initially put them in, is because even when you're just said this is 3 minutes and just go, it's still, where do I start? Where do I look? And at least when you have just this lower resolution, there's only so many boxes that it's a little easier to perceive where you need to carve. But it is definitely, you're just kind of like hitting a box when you're playing in the low resolution versus kind of like waving. It feels like a more continuous action and a little more fluid and ambiguous in terms of where you're supposed to carve for the higher resolution. So I do think it kind of does help in terms of the progression, which has been an issue in previous versions and iterations of the game. So I
Right.
tried to kind of intentionally lead the player through the low resolutions, getting a minimum score that then opens up, the medium to high resolution sculptures.
I see. So did the game go through a lot of changes as you iterated it and developed it?
A fair amount. I mean, there were a lot of just challenges in terms of translating it into VR. I mean, there were some just kind of performance, technical, voxel based challenges, but also like I wanted it to be a stationary experience. I'm not I don't particularly get too motion sick with VR, but I'm more comfortable. I don't want to deal with moving if I don't have to. And so it was important to have, just the ability to rotate the sculpture instead of you walking around it. And that, again, I could have made it small, so you're just carving here, but I wanted that full scale, like there's David and that's huge. And I have to, just use my entire body, because that's also something that I really like. I think is one of the potentials in VR that I am attracted to is just the fact that you aren't constrained to just tiny little movements with your hands. It's
Yeah.
this full body. I can potentially wave around and like affect things. So I really wanted that to be a part of it. So yeah. I think I lost my train of thought. But
That's all right. So, I mean, because I found myself with that physicality thing as I was playing, when I was doing the bits down at the bottom, a lot of the time I sat on the floor to do it.
yeah.
And that was kind of interesting. That kind of on a sort of physical thing is there aren't a lot of games that get you moving from a standing position to a seated position, but that's something that you do when you're making a sculpture. I mean, that's like you move around it, you see it from different angles. You have to,
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I think that, it's funny just in kind of recording footage for it, for making trailers and stuff. I always am like, I end up all sweaty and like exhausted by the end, because it is, you are kind of like waving around and using your legs more than you'd anticipate.
Yes.
And I think the other thing you mentioned was just the kind of like where to look in the sight lines, which is also something that I had to kind of iterate on and think about, because I mean it's kind of obvious, but like you have the sculpture that you're working on that you can kind of bring closer and rotate, and then kind of offset to the back, opposite your dominant hand. I have the sculpture so that you could potentially see, your sculpture hand, the slab you're working on, and then distance the source sculpture, all in the same view, which was important. And then also fitting in the score and all the rest. So it was a lot of just kind of like placement in space that I was kind of fiddling with for a while. And then also ensuring that like for lefties, it was all opposite. So I have this kind of like, you can switch to lefty and righty. And then when you do that, that angle changes and the orientation changes so that you still have that kind of path.
Yes, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I guess as soon as you're bringing physical bodies into it, you need to start thinking about stuff like that. And, one person's physical body is going to be different from another's. I mean, are there other kinds of adjustments that you need to make for that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it should do more with height. Although I tried to kind of be conservative in terms of making sure that the sculptures weren't too big. But in the future iteration, I do think like having a little bit more range in terms of height, just to make sure that everyone can touch the top of the tallest sculpture, kind of. But the left and right-handed I knew was important from the get-go, so that was one of the first things I was thinking about and implementing was, making sure everything was flexible enough so I shifted either way.
Yeah. But I think, I mean, another thing that you kind of lighted upon there that I found I really, really liked about the game was that, that in terms of lining stuff up by eye, and you're looking over there and you're going, what's your, looking and then trying to apply what you've seen and figured out. Like, it reminds me a lot of the way that you actually go about creating a piece of art, you know, whether it's a sculpture or a painting. And, you know, I have a like particularly strong connection to sculpture because my dad's a sculptor.
Oh,
And
wow.
he
Oh,
works in
that's awesome.
particular in stone. And so there was a lot in
Wow.
this that really chimed with me because, like, you know, one of it was the way that I found myself having to look at the other sculpture and, you know, and then apply it to my own because you're looking for like recognizable things, or at least I found myself looking for recognizable things that I could line up and match up. Um, and, you know, it's one of the things that my dad's always said is, you know, you draw what you see, not what you think you see. And that kind of process of, particularly on the early stages where you can get it precision correct if you know, if you really think it through, that to kind of look for these, you know, lines or reference points that you go, okay, it's safe to carve out here. To me, that felt a lot like real sculpting.
That's awesome. I mean, that's cool that your father's a sculptor. I think, you know, a lot of that definitely resonates. Um, you know, one of the big challenges, I mean, the big challenge with this game in general was just like I had a slab and then the sculpture and then I started and it was just way too hard. And so I was thinking about ways to make it less intimidating, make it easier. And one of those things was just giving more reference points. So, I mean, first of all, just which way is front? So I had to put, you know, just had the arrows for top, up, and to the front. And then also I have this like dotted line grid around both the sculptures so that there is some reference point. You definitely need a little, I mean, it's not pure sculpture, but because you don't have these things floating in space, but it really helps in terms of just knowing like, okay, here's halfway you know, from the top to the bottom on mine and on the reference. And so you can start at least using that as a guide. I think, you know, the other thing that you touched on, which I think is interesting, is when you referenced how it's like real sculpture in some ways. And one thing that I noticed in sloppy forgeries, and not being a sculptor, I'm not sure. I would assume it kind of translates to sculpting as well, but in general, a good way to start learning how to draw and paint is, you know, thinking about the whole canvas at first, and then getting kind of the big picture stuff done, and then kind of slowly start focusing in, rather than just like you kind of can see this. One thing I see in sloppy forgeries is people just go straight to the face for like a Mona Lisa or something like that, as opposed to thinking about the entire canvas. And the whole like scoring system disincentivizes that because you're given way more points for just filling in the blue background than you are for, you know, or the green background in Mona Lisa, than you are for getting the nose correctly. But that intuitively is what we identify with. And so I think there is this, you know, there is this interesting kind of like when you're just racing to finish and you're just incentivized to get as much stuff done as possible as quickly as you can, just look for the big holes and the big places to fill, which I think is actually a good way to kind of like approach creating artwork. Like, you know, often with painting, you have this underpainting where you're just using burnt sienna or whatever, like the, you know, the brown and white colors, and you're just filling lights and darks, not worrying about details. So that kind of thinking, I think, is one thing that I kind of discovered about these kinds of games just by that's kind of bubbled up from how they were created, but that I do think there's some value in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's kind of interesting that that's something that comes from like the computer part of it, is that because, you know, the computer is not seeing this as a painting. The computer is seeing it, you know, and I'm showing footage of sloppy forgeries at the moment for reference. But like the computer doesn't know what a face is. It doesn't know what the Mona Lisa is. It knows what color pixel should go where. And, you know, I think, you know, my first kind of glance of it is it kind of makes you look at the picture differently because you have to think of it like a computer does. but I'd not thought of it as something that, like, that being able to objectify an image, being able to stop looking at, what does it represent and start looking at what do I actually see? Like, that's a really useful art skill.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, within sloppy forgeries, it's interesting because it also encourages you to think about like swaths of color abstractly and not as much of like what it represents. Because if you're just, the idea is you're trying to get as much of the colors correct as possible. So if you're just thinking about, okay, this green starts here and it goes around this, and there's a big bunch of green over here. Yeah, it can kind of help you visualize things a little bit differently and step back from that kind of representational, this has to look like a face, and more of like, let's think about the painting as a whole. But yeah, you're right. And it's also something that it just came from kind of the algorithm, just comparing two images. And it's something that, some people, it's not completely obvious that that is the, how it's compared. So some people initially would think that maybe there's some sophisticated AI that's kind of like evaluating the similarity in some way. And, at some point I was considering like maybe experimenting with that, but I do like this kind of like, there's no ambiguity, right? If that's a green pixel and that's a green pixel, then it's right. I like that kind of clarity once people understand it. I mean, it can be frustrating if you have the perfect image that's over 20 pixels, then all those are incorrect, right? But I think balancing that kind of having the clarity and also the fact that it does incentivize this kind of just, looking at kind of like large swaths as opposed to details at first.
Yeah. So, I mean, is this like, because I think you did mention briefly, you definitely mentioned as we were chatting before the show, but you do have a background as an artist. Like you were, was it your double major that you did in undergrad? Is that right?
Yeah. So I was in undergrad. I did was a double major in computer science and visual art, and the visual art was just studio-based work. So mostly oil painting, and I did a lot of. I was in Maine, which is a beautiful part of the U.S. So did a lot of landscape painting, driving around and finding nice spots and stuff. So yeah, I've always had that interest, and always thought that just generally art making and games seems so symbiotic. Like that there's just to me there seems to be this enormous space to explore, and yeah, and I also just like making games that I definitely prioritize creating games that I would like to play. And so just the simple idea of why not have a race where you can just as fast as you can paint something and evaluate that. It's kind of just where it came from. So yeah.
So I mean, from going from painting to sculpture, like was that just a kind of a natural stepping stone for you, or was that more, what was the trajectory there?
Yeah. So it started with obviously with sloppy forgeries. I created that game, and then shortly afterwards I started kind of experimenting with VR and preparation for teaching this AR VR course. I was also once the kind of controllers came out for VR, that's when I was like, okay, this is really interesting to explore, and just interactively, because that's what I'm most drawn to, is just new kind of interactive possibilities, and also the full body kind of possibility of full body interactions and using your entire body. And so I mean, there was definitely, I think I might have written it down in my notebook where it was like, oh, VR sloppy forgeries, that's something that I could consider, but it was never like, I'm going to do that. Like, it was never front and center for a while. But so what ended up happening when I was kind of exploring VR, I was thinking a lot about just marking space and like moving in 3D space to fully take advantage of the controllers. So I was playing a lot of tilt brush. And also thinking about like follow the leader. So maybe some sort of like you make a gesture and someone else has to copy that. And maybe there's, you know, these weird kind of shapes that you would make, and they would have to try to figure out how to kind of copy them. Maybe you're doing two at once. But all this marking in space got me kind of thinking back to, well, you know, sculpture is it's kind of like one of the most primitive ways of that we can kind of take a form and create something out of it. It's just kind of opposite, right? It's negative space, you're carving as opposed to creating. So I like that, plus just that, like, this is something you can't do without VR, is carving something naturally. And so that was like, okay. And then I realized that, well, that's what I have to do now.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like, you know, that thing about the negative space, and, you know, thinking about, you know, talking to my dad about his sculpture making, and that, like, you know, when you're carving stone, like, it's usually a very slow process, because, you know, you can't afford to make mistakes, because if you chop off the wrong bit of stone, that bit of stone is gone. There's no gluing it back on. There's no eraser that you can use to get it back to how it was. And it's interesting, like, I think there's a couple of interesting ways that that's reflected in the game, because, you know, one of them is, like, if you make a mistake by having, you know, a block of stone where there shouldn't be one, that's a mistake you can correct. If you take out the wrong block of stone, then, you know, you can't undo that mistake and you have to live with it. And I kind of, you know, when I was playing it, I found it made some of the bits really tense, because it's like, well, I know there's a gap between the legs here. I know there's an arch under Michelangelo's arms, but if I put it in the wrong place, I'm going to make this worse. And you have to, the only way to do well at the sculpture is to live with that fear and go for it anyway, and maybe you'll get it wrong, but, you know, I really, really like that about it.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned that. That's exactly the moment that I like, between the legs, when they're, you know, there's one like here and like, where is that? Or between the arms, and these moments where you're just like, it's kind of tense. You're just like, I know this could make a difference between, you know, getting that 80% or whatever. So yeah, and that was something that I was thinking about whether or not, because obviously you could just put like hold down a button and recreate, you know. But in terms of that, like, just, we talked about previously about incentivizing just going for it, and like, you know, because I think you could get a little fiddly if you could just keep on adding things and like get a little bit perfectionist and just letting loose and just like, okay, it is what it is. So I thought it was kind of better to embrace that.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that helps you just go for it is, of course, the time limit. Like, so it's 2 minutes, isn't it? 120 seconds that you have to cover the whole thing. And so, I mean, was it always going to be a time limited thing? Was there a part of you that said, oh, maybe I should make a kind of a free play infinite time thing?
Yeah, I mean, coming from Sloppy Forge, it was always timed. Like, that version was always timed. There definitely, you know, crossed my mind to kind of have a few different times for as options. But I think, you know, just simplifying things, you know, it's a little bit longer than you have for Sloppy Forgers, and you definitely need that extra time. But there's definitely, like, when you're entering 4 to 5 minute territory, it feels like, you know, just kind of, it's harder to give up, or it's easier to give up. But there's something about, like, I know the ending's coming within this kind of general time. I can always try again.
Yeah.
You know, that felt right. That felt like, and also, again, just wanting to not be fiddly and just kind of like do it, be done with it. You know, the whole fail faster mantra, let's do it again. So yeah, that's kind of how I landed there.
Yeah. Now, in your submission, you talked about like the act of copying being a kind of inspiration. How kind of, I guess, you know, copying, you know, because and I guess I'll be honest, I can't remember if this is something that you said or something that I noted down as I was reading your submission. But the act of copying, like, is something that in the olden days artists used to do to train to be artists. You know, you would be an apprentice to a master and you would learn to copy the master's works. So I'm kind of curious about, like, I guess, like, is there, are you exploring kind of deeper ideas between what it means for something to be a copy, or what the purpose of copying is for?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a definitely a rich history of copying in both art and in games. I mean, in art, like you mentioned, um, there is just as an apprentice, right? You kind of copy um, all the time your other paintings. There's also as a as an art student, there's this classic assignment, which is the master study, where you're essentially taking some artwork that inspires you that you find particularly interesting, and you just copy it. Like you just figure out exactly the dimensions of the canvas, and you just try to recreate it. And there's a lot that you learn just in doing that. So that's definitely something I thought a lot about. Also within games, just really simple games, kid games like Follow the Leader. There's a pleasure in just accurately copying somebody.
Yeah.
Like all rhythm-based games, like what you're supposed to do. There's no question. It's just literally copying what you're being told to do at the right time. And so it's just I find it interesting to think about like copying in Choppy Copy is in those contexts because both in terms of like the usefulness in art making, but also within kind of like all the best games are easy to learn but difficult to master, right? That's like a Nolan Bushnell quote or whatever, and like that's to me is the core of what makes choppy copies and sloppy forgeries interesting. Like it's just impossible to actually accomplish the task. It's super easy. You know what you have to do. It's just really hard to do.
Yes. Yes.
And it's all skill based, so which is fun to practice in.
Yeah. I guess that's interesting, the idea of it being impossible to do it perfectly, but it's always possible to do it better. I think that's
Right.
a nice dynamic to have.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So as a project, I mean, where is it in development at the moment? Are you are you still experimenting with the idea? Are you nearing a release? Like, what's your trajectory?
I'm thinking, I've been a little trying to figure it out. I think I'm probably going to try to release a version on like in the App Lab for Oculus and kind of go from there. There's obviously, it's funny because I released it, coming from Sloppy Forgeries where it's a multiplayer game. This being a single player game, they came to it. A lot of people who played Sloppy Forgeries came to it with that kind of expectation, which I think kind of a little bit of a letdown. Of
Right.
course, having two VRs and doing the multiplayer thing is a little more challenging, but doable. So that's something I've also been considering is whether or not to kind of have. I mean, it could be cool to have people kind of surrounding a sculpture and everyone's working on the same one. So you get to see kind of people also carving their own versions. But I'm still trying to figure out kind of how much that would add. But yeah, I think I'll probably start with kind of like adding a few more sculptures, a little longer progression, and then kind of releasing it and seeing what happens.
Yeah.
Oh, and also like a gallery. So I feel like
yes.
yeah. So having like a high score, but you see the sculptures, I feel like there's definitely I would like to see that.
Yeah.
Like the top.
Well, and then to be able to see, like, I mean, you must have seen some really bizarre looking sculptures that people have made.
Yeah.
Like, any
Right. Yeah.
particular
And also,
standouts?
I don't know. I have actually I've exhibited sloppy forgeries a lot more, so I know that kind of. For those I kind of collected all the images, which was fun, and then kind of like played around with different visualizations of like averages and kind of like of what those paintings would look like if you just averaged everyone's painting and you get this kind of blurry ghost-like image, or if you take the mode statistically, you get this weird kind of visualizations of like 1,000 people painting your Mona Lisa and what's most important. So that's kind of I've been thinking about that as well with choppy copies in terms of data and what might be interesting.
Yeah.
And,
Is there? I mean, do you have these pictures, these averaged out paintings? Are they online somewhere that we can take a look at?
I think so. Actually, I'm not sure. I should put them up.
Right.
I will. Now that you mentioned, I'll do that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe if you post them to your Twitter, and everybody at home, Jonah's Twitter handle at Playful Systems is right below his name on the screen there. I guess one more kind of curious question about like the creation of it is how did you source the voxel models of the sculptures?
So those there's a project called Scan the World,
right?
Which is kind of like an open source database of 3D models. I think it's primarily geared towards like for 3D printing. So if you wanted a small, print a copy of David, you could go and do that. But it has, these pretty nice, clean, high resolution, models that I then just downloaded and kind of manipulated to make into voxels and kind of a data format that I then read in.
Right. And do you have to do you tweak and edit them after that, or do they are they kind of basically that is the raw interpretation of the thing?
So for choppy copies, I just use the raw data because it works well. But for sloppy forgeries, I definitely would need to. I kind of had an initial pass with an algorithm that would kind of posterize the image, just reduce it in color to 4 or 5 colors. But then I would need to go back in because just to make sure that some details that feel most important to the human eye were represented a little bit more clearly. So that was a little more labor intensive.
I see. Yes, that makes sense. That is, yeah, that kind of human element where you have to, I guess, we kind of read color differently to how we read form, don't we?
Yep, definitely. Some of the colors that the computer would choose just didn't feel right, or if they're, just the shading on a face, for example, of the Mona Lisa kind of has to be exactly perfect for,
yes,
or it just has to be right, feel right for us versus
yes. That's really interesting. That's getting me thinking that. So I thought we might sort of move on from choppy copies now, just to talk a bit about your background and the other things that you've worked on and you've made. So I think perhaps a good starting point would be the question of how did you get started making games?
So I started pretty early. So it's going to date me, but my parents never. I always every year I asked for the first Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, and I never got one. They never got it for me, and
Right.
so I was kind of incentivized to. But I did have one of those first Mac computers, and so and I was always interested. Like from an early age, I was pretty interested in making art and also working with computers. And my father was a computer science professor, so I had some kind of background in programming. And so from an early age, I used this. There's this program called HyperCard,
Right.
which was fantastic. It was like basically allowed you to make point and click. I mean, it was productivity software. Like you used it. It was kind of like you had these index cards with the metaphor, and so you could use it for presentations or whatever. But it had this very simple scripting language that allowed you to do things like click on this and go to this other card. It was oftentimes talked about as a precursor to the web, just in terms of like structurally, because it was all hypertext, and also linked different cards. So I just made these like terrible games where you just point and click games where you go to a castle and would wander around town. But they also had you could also do some things with timing based. So I'd have one where like you asked for a drink, the bartender turned around and you have to steal the keys or something. And then from there, I kind of didn't touch making games for a while. Although I kind of just learned programming on like the TI-85. Like there was this little calculator that you could program, and so I remember making some like card games on that. But didn't really, and then think about it as that much more until grad school, where I went for a design and technology program at Parsons School of Design in New York, where I started realizing like I was really interested in just experimenting with interactivity. So like, you know, different kinds of interfaces, different kinds of novel interactions. And so exploring that space was really exciting to me. It was also a way to kind of combine creativity with my programming skills, and like it felt magical, you know, like but and then I slowly started realizing like the most exciting place to do that is within games. You don't have this kind of preconceived goal, or you don't have this like way of interacting that you don't want to get from. It's not just about getting from point A to point B. I mean, it may be, but you make it up, right? So you kind of make up the interactions, and starting there kind of is what I like to do. So starting with the interesting interactions and then building out the context for that, where exploration is part of it, and it's fun. It's not just like creating a web page where you like try to sell something or get from A to B. So that kind of, then I was like, wow, this is what games is about. So that was pretty eye-opening for me.
Right.
And where it kind of like started.
I see. So that was your MFA you did at Parsons?
Yeah, they had
am I right in thinking you were doing a lot of kind of like body tracking, motion tracking type stuff, like
right.
Is
yeah,
this...
so there was a
Oh no, go ahead.
It was pre-Connect, so that it was right maybe 2 years before the Connect came out, where the computers were starting to be powerful enough to take in like real-time video from a video camera and process it in real time. So I was playing around with a lot with that, and kind of made up a series of games. My thesis was called Full Body Interaction in Video Games. And so it was kind of exploring the possibility space of if you were to have your body as a controller, essentially like very much like a Kinect, where your silhouette is extracted from a video feed that's projected in front of you, and then along with other simple graphic objects. So the simplest example of the games in my suite was called Duck and Jump, where you have blocks that are floating at your head that you have to duck under, and then that are coming at your feet that you have to jump over. And if you touch one of them, then you lose a life and you have 5 lives, and just trying to last as long as you can. So
yeah,
that's a lot of where my interest in that, you know, in the VR full body
right
came from.
So I'm showing some. I realize you can't see this at the moment. I'm showing some footage. It's a video I found on your website. It's the full body games at the Gaga Gallery. So is that something that you were doing, like as part of your MFA, or is this, you know, something you were working on, having moved on from that?
That's a pretty fun story. That one, a bunch of friends and I kind of came together. We had a friend who graduated from Parsons, and she rented out a gallery space in the Lower East Side of New York. It was on the like a street front, so like it was basically a half a story up storefront space. And so it was relatively cheap. So a bunch of friends and I kind of rented out that gallery for a month, and we each took a week. And so for the week, I had a friend kind of join me, and we put that full body games inside. And then there was also this big window. And so we did this projection, set up a mirror and outside on the window, and projected from the mirror, and that kind of went back down on the sidewalk, where we also had this similarly kind of interactive piece that had a camera that was kind of aligned to the same area that the projection was, and it was just a colored grid of squares, and if you walked through it, they would kind of scatter and come back into place. So, which was really fun, because, you know, that kind of interactive projection stuff wasn't that not a lot of people have been exposed to it, and then just seeing it was like in a very active part of town, especially at night. So there's a lot of drunk people walking around, just like, whoa, what is this thing?
Right. What was this? Sorry, this is a public space that people could just walk into, or are we talking this was outdoors? Like,
so this was it was on the sidewalk.
Oh, right.
in New York. So they would have to walk through if they're walking on the sidewalk, this interactive projection. So some people would just walk through and not even notice, but most people would walk through and look back and they see up, the colored squares kind of snapping back into place as they walk through it, and then they'd start playing around. And we
That's
got a lot of video
interesting.
footage from that.
Yeah.
It was fun.
I like that. Must be quite a magical experience to be you're out on the street and you've left behind some kind of strange trail or something like that and to be able that must really make your night to come across something like
Yeah.
that.
No, we met so many people. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We have a lot of people just kind of all of a sudden it became a dance floor to them, or like they kind of became the center of attention, or would do these kind of different kind of moves. People would do like somersaults and cartwheels over it. So yeah, it was fun.
Sounds amazing. I mean, I love the kind of the free form nature of it. That the idea of you give people a toy, and
Yeah,
what they do with it is entirely their own. Yeah, that's their own magic moment for themselves. There's something quite special and generous in that.
completely. Yeah, there's something that I really love about those open-ended kind of interactive spaces. We'd set up that installation at a festival in Chicago, and it was funny. There was like this group of, I think it was a family, and this kid and his father, who were kind of like, basically they realized that the system, it was motion based. So if there was enough pixel change in the video image, I would trigger the box to fly out and snap back into place. And if you went slow enough, the video image wouldn't detect any change, and it wouldn't kind of trigger the interaction or the animation. And so they just realized this idea, this thing, and so they just spent like half hour going as slowly as they could through the image, trying to make sure that it wouldn't trigger anything. And became this competition and this
Oh
thing, and
wow.
they're like, hey, we figured out the point of your thing. Like, yeah, that's exactly what I was going for.
Yeah.
No, but it's amazing to see, when that happens, where it's just like it's open enough so people can figure out their own way to interact with it. That's surprising.
Yeah.
Fun.
I mean, is that a kind of lesson that you took with you going forwards about that kind of being open to flexibility? I mean, that definitely speaks to a lot of what's in sloppy forgeries and choppy copies is that openness to, it's that it's not you either do it the right way or the wrong way. It's
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, those are like, what the goal is, but how you get there is very open in what you prioritize. Um, and so it is something that I always try to consider when making games that I think is important.
yeah. And so this was with you did this as part of a team called Feed Tank, is that right?
Yep. So that's where it was a small company, just myself and a friend. That's where the whole thing started, and it kind of um, snowballed just in terms of a lot of people. We kind of made contacts with people from that experience, and then they were like, "Oh, we want it at this trade show, or we want this interactive projection here and there." And so we kind of started a small business making those interactive projections.
Right.
It was always kind of like half artistic, half
Yeah.
commercial. So we never. It was kind of like a half-time thing, and it was great because it enabled us to travel a lot of like to Singapore and all these different places,
Yeah.
set it up. So we found it more fun just as to make some money and travel, but not as like a full-fledged business opportunity.
Yeah. But I mean it must have been an exciting thing to be doing. I mean, like what other things did you go on to create?
So we did a bunch of different things. I think the three biggest ones were the full body games. We called that interactive floor, called it Dance Floor Moves.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had another one that was a musical instrument called Transpose, which
Right.
was also based on this kind of computer vision. Your silhouette's projected in front of you, and then you have these two different bars on either side. When you overlap one of those bars with your hand, it would create a tone. You could bend that tone, change the pitch by going up and down with both hands, and then you could also kind of record loops, store them in kind of like these different spots and kind of replay them and play along with it, choose different instruments. And yeah, I did a lot of different experimentation. Did one kind of like a drum visualization where we just hooked up drum pads to triggers to drums, a drum set, and then kind of had a vocabulary of different visual elements that would happen in real time as you played drums. Yeah, a lot of them were kind of computer vision, physical, interactive pieces.
Yeah, that sounds. It sounds like fascinating stuff, and like I think like to be able to engage with the physical movement and stuff like that is such an exciting opportunity, and to be able to be in on the ground on that stuff before before Connect was happening and all of that, it must be seemed like quite a brave new world. And I think there's definitely a lot of us within alternative controllers who've kind of come away inspired by a lot of experimental things that were being done with computer vision, with motion controls. I think the number of people I know who have taken inspiration from Johann Sebastian Joust, for example, which includes myself. It is like interesting to look back on on the technology and see kind of how formative it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's been around. This stuff's been around for quite a while. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Myron Kruger's work, or anyone on the stream, but I definitely recommend checking out his stuff. He was actually based in Connecticut
Right.
for a while, and he had this piece called Video Place, and this was like in the late 70s, I think, maybe early 80s, where he basically explored the interactive space. He thought of art. He wanted to explore art as in like the interactivity is the medium, right? So he did a lot with computer vision. He was really pushing the boundaries of what was possible in terms of processing power at the time, but also, so he came up with this like 20 to 50 different simple interactions using silhouettes, interacting with various objects. So it completely is what inspired full body games. Right. I just took it to a little bit more of a games context, but I was using a lot of the vocabulary and kind of simple constraints and the kind of background subtraction computer vision techniques that he used and was exploring. So there's a kind of a rich history to it all.
Yeah. And I guess also a rich history to the way that, that games and art overlap, so often is that, there isn't, a lot of this technology, is being, pioneered by games people and used in art, and pioneered by artists and used in games. And it's nice, a nice kind of, to be able to take the influence from, from an area that is not, these are, I mean, what you're making, is games. They're not necessarily, and maybe this isn't true, maybe there are game inspirations behind them, but they feel like these are games that are inspired by the process of art making rather than inspired by other games. I mean, would you say that's true?
Yeah, that's definitely true. For me, I feel like I'm a kind of, as a game designer, I'm more of an opportunist. Like I'm more inspired by like, oh, I see the space of possibility that like I haven't seen a game done like this, and that sounds kind of, I want to play it, or I want to, and it's so that's why some of my games can kind of seem all over the place. But you're right, they're mostly not inspired by other games. I mean, occasionally they are, and I have nothing against that. It's more just kind of like I'm personally also not like, I wouldn't consider myself a hardcore gamer. I love playing games. But like I said before, the way that I got drawn into games, I actually almost love making games more than I like playing them. Like there's just something about that kind of like the magic of making this kind of interactive thing and then seeing people interact with it and have fun with it. That's just, and there's such a, what's the word? There's just such a, there's like a, it either works or it doesn't. It's so clear. You know what I mean? Like there's a, if you get it right, it just feels like, wow, there's this magical moment that can happen. And so I think just naturally, since I'm not as playing games all the time, it's easier for me to be influenced by other things and kind of bring other parts or things that I'm interested in to games.
Yeah.
You know.
So, I mean, do you have? I mean, obviously, art making is a big thing for you. Are there other things that you brought into your work or into your process?
Well, I mean, I think we talked about the full body interaction. I was always I was just really into sports as a child. So I always I felt like there was this natural like play and physicality that was missing in video games, and that's something I always wanted to kind of explore. So I think that definitely had an influence. Also, the um, I created a game called Word After Word, which it's very simple. It's super simple, but it's pretty fun. It's essentially kind of like, I don't know if you have Family Feud over there in the UK or know that game.
We do. We call it Family Fortunes, but it's
Family
just, yeah.
Fortunes, nice. So they have this moment in that game where a game show where you are kind of like you face off and you're supposed to give the top 10 X, Y, or Z, some sort of question, and it's a survey, and then the top answers. If you get the top answer, you get more points. So this is kind of half inspired by that, and also this Google released this kind of something called Google Ngram Viewer,
Right.
which allowed you to visualize word usage in this massive data set of books that they've scanned in over time. So you could essentially look for how some, any kind of phrase, so like you guys, maybe, it's kind of popular now, how much that's used. It was so you could have this little bar graph of like, you could see how that's changed over time. So I thought that would be an interesting, just kind of like data set to explore if there was some sort of multiplayer game where that could be the evaluation would happen within the frequency of the data. And so I started exploring that, and it was like one of those ideas that I'd written down, and like 5 years later, I'm like, maybe I should do that. So, and it turned out that data set was it felt very academic and formal. I didn't feel like I wanted something like more common word usage. And so there is like a whole world out there for linguists who study language and data sets geared towards them that have similar needs. So there's one called the American Corpus of Contemporary English or American English, that has it has kind of the sources from only books, but it's also from like radio programs and TV. So there's a lot more spoken language in that data set. And so I use that to then just make a simple game where each person had their own computer or their own keyboard connected to the same computer. They're all given the same adjective, and you have to type in the noun that you think most commonly follows that adjective. And they're then given a score from that data set, how frequently that word pair exists. Which was the cool thing about that is that there's potentially hundreds, sometimes thousands maybe, of correct answers that get scored. So there's this, it's not like the top 10, you have at least hundreds of answers that will be scored at varying degrees.
So because I played this at a maze in 2017, I think it was. And it won. Am I right in thinking it won the Human Machine Award that year?
Yep, it did. That was a surprise.
Congratulations for that, and I have to say,
thank you.
It was very well deserved. I absolutely love playing this.
Nice.
And I think there is something that really appealed to me about the kind of, the kind of woolly data of it. So this idea that, and I think word games are quite, good at providing these kind of woolly data kind of puzzles where, there is the right answer. There is a most common word that comes after the adjective good, for example. But there's no logic behind that. It's all based on, and what you think will be the most popular word, that's going to be affected by all kinds of individual biases you might have, what you've grown up around, and maybe it changes with different accents around the world. And I like, I love it as a game that plays with that woolliness.
Yeah, no, it's a very I mean, obviously it's one data set. It's I'm sure that has its own biases, but there is just the approximation, I think, just works, even if it's just this one data set. And it is, there's some fun kind of like gameplay strategies that you can employ. Like there's one, since everyone has the same adjective, it's beneficial to get the first crack at giving your word, because each one has to be a different word. So one of the things was, you want to disincentivize people from just kind of hitting return and just getting a bunch of wrong ones till they get a new word that they can do. So I have the system where if it's not even scored, it's a strike, and if you have 5 strikes, then your score resets.
Right.
But what does allow you to do is get okay answers. So you can just kind of like, as long as you type it in, it's an okay answer and it's been scored, you can get ahead. And I think that's also a decent thing to kind of incentivize. It's just another strategy, right. But it kind of like plays into the strength of the data set and this fuzziness that you mentioned.
Yeah. So you're thinking of, like, the strategy is, if you want to get ahead, put in the first word you think of, but that first word you think of has to be good enough. Is that the kind of mentality?
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. Yeah. I like that. And of course, the uncertainty behind that is a lovely
right. There's a bit of a risk.
With. Yeah. And on a technical level, so this is played with multiple keyboards plugged into the same computer.
Yes.
Like, how straightforward is that to set up?
Well, if you do it yourself, it's a pain. But there are some tools out there. Like when I was making this, I did some research, and I didn't really want to get into the lower level driver code if I didn't have to. So I found a library that was written in Java. So I used this program called processing to write it in, and then imported the Java code.
Right.
So that wasn't too bad, but it's that code base is a little old at this point. But there are other options for if you're working in Unity. There is this plugin that I think it's called multi-input. It might be like $20. That does allow you to get multiple keyboards and mice into the computer and recognize them as different inputs, because that's the challenge. Usually by default, you have 2 mice and it's one set of data, and most programs will just interpret it as one. Same with the keyboard. But these libraries do let you get to the low level and interpret them differently.
Right. That's interesting. That's yeah, I didn't know that was a thing, but it is it does kind of turn you on your head the way a computer's supposed to work. The idea that, there's these things called keyboards and mice, and there's only supposed to be one of them. I think there's something nice about and subversive about, as an installation, walking into, an exhibition and seeing an array of keyboards attached to one screen. There's a nice little magic moment in that.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's one of the things I really wanted to get working for it.
Yeah.
Instead of just making it some sort of multiplayer thing, just having the people next to each other, there's like an intensity of like a keyboard, but you don't really see that often, right? With everyone on the keyboard, and also with the mouse, with sloppy forgery, is that's where that came it naturally led into the multiple mouse thing.
Yeah.
And I still think that there's like potentials that to be explored of like, what is a, two mouse game, 2v2, like 1v1, each person has 2 mice. Like, what kind of game would that be?
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, maybe like, I'm quite curious to know a bit more about sloppy forgeries. Obviously, you've used it a lot as a reference point for where the inspirations for choppy copies came from, but like, where did the inspiration for sloppy forgeries emerge from?
So that was partially from, just this interest in drawing and painting. I always had one of the, I think, primary, one of the most inspiring interactive pieces from my when I started getting into from the master's program in just design and technology in general was this piece called Yellowtail by Golan Levin.
Right.
And it's essentially a drawing program, incredibly simple. This very simple algorithm where if you draw a gesture on the screen, it records that gesture and then plays it again, but starting from where you left off. So if you make a loop, it will continue, it'll take that data of that loop and start from the beginning and doing that again. And it just continues across the screen, and then he makes it so it loops. But you can do, these very simple, quick animations of just these magical gestures that continue.
Yeah.
So that I always found that to be interesting. And he did a number of these kind of. They were also audio visual in nature, so he had audio corresponding. These were mostly meant to be like drawing tools that would also create music. So that was one. You had like a line on the screen, so if it crossed it, it would play a tone based on how long it overlapped and where it overlapped. And he had a number of other kind of simple programs that would do this kind of thing. So that kind of the potential of drawing as an interactive form, not necessarily about, just abstractly, not necessarily about representation or art, was kind of a big thing that's always been percolating in my mind.
I guess you get a thing with sloppy forgeries where, images are created out of it, and they are beautiful in their own right, whether or not, they look, just like the original or whatever. They have their own beauty, they have their own things, and these are a beauty that has been created by, I guess, the system, the tool that was given to you, the set of paint colors and the set of brush sizes that you had, and then also the challenge itself. The challenge is a system which generates art through a human. There is this interesting kind of like combination of human art making and computer systems art making, fusing together because of the game.
Yep. No, exactly. I think there's also a whole bunch of other inspirations. Just like I love those early paint programs. There's just like the simplicity of these kind of jagged drawing shapes, and these simple like big paint tools. I grew up with that, so there's some nostalgia there, but also like that they're so clumsy that they're kind of fun to embrace. Like you can't have a small one, you just have the big ones. What can you do?
Yes.
The huge brushes. And then also like the full body stuff, and just from a technical perspective, like I was doing a lot of like analyzing of imagery and the computer vision techniques, which just made it very easy to compare images and know how to do that in a way that was pretty performant. So it all kind of came together.
Yeah. So do you have a kind of idea in your head, like is there like for you, like are these games, sloppy forgeries and choppy copies, I guess your installations as well, do you see these as a means of allowing people to be more creative, encouraging people to be more creative? Like what's your, like, is there a message that you want your players to come away with?
I mean, I think I think I kind of stumbled into, again, like I have these interests, and I do think that, like, generally speaking, I'm an opportunist. So I see like, okay, this would be cool, and I would like to do this. But then I think in creating sloppy forgeries and in some of the other works, I did realize that like there's a value in kind of taking these forms that can be kind of these traditional kind of conservative or potentially intimidating art practices, breaking it down, making it just so you have to do it quickly and you have these limited things. It's impossible. So embrace the messiness and let's just get on with it and try and like do it again. That I really enjoyed. It was such a such a pleasure to like watch people play that game, just going to places because inevitably people would just laugh and point and but then like let's do it again, and so it just there is just something that made me want to make more games like that,
Yeah.
and that's kind of where Choppy Copies came from.
Right. That's fascinating. I mean, I feel like we've kind of, in terms of your oeuvre, we've kind of come full circle now to Choppy Copies, but there is something that I do want to find out a bit more about, and perhaps this might be, our kind of sort of, I guess, closing topic is, because you work as a professor at, and I apologize, I've forgotten the name of the university.
Quinnipiac University.
Quinnipiac University, and you're teaching game design there. I mean, what kind of stuff are you teaching, and does the work that you are making, like, with Choppy Copies and everything you just talked about, does that come into it as a teacher?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a number of ways, like you said, having inspiration from outside games is something I always encourage our students. I feel like it just leads to more kind of unique, interesting kinds of games. I think also, like I run a course, the AR/VR course. We do a lot of thinking and talking about the unique affordances of the technology in terms of what it can do and what's different about it. Where I really think we encourage them to think about physicality and like using space and the things and the environments that you can interact with. I also think, a lot of the games that I like have these very tight constraints. And so that's something I'm always talking about in my classes. There's, an assignment in one of my classes that's all about, physical computing and alternative controllers. Again, thinking about beyond just, and where I show them it's kind of simple code for multiple mice, multiple keyboard. What can we do? Or just using your phone as a controller and getting input in the computer from tilting and all that stuff. And then also, in terms of constraints, I feel like, some of these games feel like a little bit like tools, like sloppy forgeries and choppy copies. So I have a strong interest in kind of creative tool making in general, not even just outside of games, but also game making tools. So I have like a strong interest in small little tiny constraint game engines like Twine or Bitsy or Puzzle Script. These games, I just love them. They're just like these little, we were also talking about earlier about kind of like how just no constraints, how creativity can somehow be overwhelming, like knowing what to do. Like I'm not a creative person. And I think that having these tools where you got these tight constraints where you don't have to make a lot of decisions about like, if I'm going to make this character, it's a 5x5 pixel thing, and there's only one place for a head. It just, so a lot of that stuff, there's no choice, but it focuses your energies on like a specific, like for Twine, it's narrative, or for Bitsy, it's kind of world building, or Puzzle Script, it's like problem solving. And so I think constraints are just so much about like so important in games. So it's something that I think I bring from my kind of game designer hat that I bring into the classroom.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think it is kind of, I find it like what you're talking about the constraints there. It is interesting how we, as human beings, I guess the question I'm wondering is, why is it that constraints are such an effective thing for us? I mean, I feel like it goes beyond just, the overwhelmingness of an open choice. I mean, I wonder if for many of us, we are more accustomed to like solving a problem than we are to just be creative. Be creative is such a, is such a sort of amorphous thing. But solving a problem, we know how to solve problems. We feel good when we solve problems. And maybe what the constraint, and then this is just me musing now, maybe what the way that constraints like guide us like creatively is that we are like we're taking away the problem from be creative and turning it into solve a problem, which is a much more kind of satisfying objective to have.
No, I think that's really true. I think, yeah, it can just be your aimlessness is suddenly focused, right? Like you're now, this is what I have to do. And I think that just how much more can you focus your energies on becoming more of a solving experience than just this open-ended, like anything goes. And so I think, within those tools, they kind of start focusing and narrowing that gap within a certain genre. For example, like Twine is like, there's no graphics. Can't think about that. It's only, your energy is focused on solving. The problem is like, okay, how can we make this kind of interesting within, the constraints that we've got here for any one of those tools in generally. So yeah, I think there's something to that.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear it, because that makes me feel really smart.
Yeah, no, totally true.
So I guess we're coming to the end of the discussion now. I mean, one thing I want to just return to Choppy copies, and just what should we be looking out for? I know I've already asked what your next steps were, but maybe this is worth reiterating for everyone watching at home, so they can know when they should get their pre-orders in on whatever stores it is, or all of that, the above.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been working primarily with Oculus, so I think that it would make most sense. My next steps would be to get into the App Store, the App Lab, their kind of experimental store, and then hopefully get into the Oculus Store. My plan is to kind of add some additional, minimally just add a number of other sculptures. First of all, I think that high score kind of gallery will be important, so that folks can see kind of like the high score. There's just like something about having the nice thing about these games is there's like a visualization of like your history of what you've done. That's kind of like at the end, you can look at it and appreciate like, okay, you see the variation of like, this is the high scoring, 80% of the voxels are correct, but which 80 and like, what did they prioritize and so I think there's like something cool about that. And then also just having a little bit more of a progression through, right now there's like maybe 5 or 6 different steps that you have to complete to then open up other things. And I think just a little bit more of that process. And then hopefully by the summer I'll have it up in the App Lab. And if folks are interested in playtesting, get in touch.
That sounds fantastic. And where can people go to find out more about yourself and what you're doing?
So you can either go to playfulsystems.com or playfulsystems at Twitter is my handle there. Those are probably the 2 best places.
Fantastic. Anything else you'd like to share with us before we head off?
No, this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you about just art and games in general. That's kind of a passion of mine, and so having that opportunity to talk to a fellow, game designer and artist who wants to incorporate those two and exploring the space was fantastic.
Well, I mean, the feeling is absolutely mutual. I have really, really enjoyed having this, and I have come away. I mean, I was already fascinated by your work. I'm now even more fascinated. This has been a really, really interesting discussion. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And of course, congratulations once again on the nomination.
Thank you.
So this is, I'll just change the layout. Here we go. This is the end of our interview with Jonah, but just to let you know, that there are going to be more interviews with the nominees from this year's IndieCade Festival here on the IndieCade Twitch channel. So the Beyond Screen show tomorrow night at the same time. That's 8 o'clock in the UK, 3 o'clock Pacific. No, 3 o'clock Eastern time, 12 noon Pacific. We are going to be back with Matt Betancourt and the Mouse and the Billionaire team to talk about their alternative controller installation, Tic Atmos. So do come along, that's tomorrow night, come along and give us a watch. As always, thank you all so much for coming along, and if you want to find out more about this year's festival and this year's nominees, head down to the link at the bottom of the screen, right where I'm pointing, indiecade.com/festival-2022. So thank you all very much for coming along. Thank you, Jonah, once again for your time. This has been an absolutely fascinating interview. And I guess we shall see you all again soon. All right. Cheerio, Jonah.
Thanks.
See you later, everyone. Bye.